that the overwhelming majority of people that he talks to agree with him. The Russians, in a sense, are fed up and they're tired of the war in general. And the idea that Ukraine is now escalating by hitting the homeland, the Russian homeland, more and more is just unacceptable. So something has to be done.
Same as in Europe, I think Ukraine was kind of the last chance to defeat the Russians, but there's no other large proxy army you can build in that part of the world.
No, I mean, if the United States and Israel together could not defeat Iran, I mean, who else could?
Welcome back. We are joined again by Professor John Mearsheimer to discuss the events of the world. Thank you, as always, for coming back on.
You're welcome, Glenn. I'm glad to be here.
So it's starting to feel like we're already in a third world war here, because as you saw, the weekend attacks on Moscow, they were quite extensive, and I at least go with the assumption that this had some form of Western assistance. Simply because, the Ukraine's been using NATO weapons. NATO's been involved in the war planning, the intelligence, the target selection, and they even have contractors operating some of the weapons and also assist to evade Russian air defenses. But then we saw attacks coming from NATO territory. We heard the Baltic states and Finland argue that, well, they didn't give permission for this, and they said that they did not approve, but it still happens yet again. But now we see the Europeans, they're mass producing this, or at least they're stating their intent to mass produce long-range strike weapons for this explicit purpose of striking deep inside Russia. They make the case why the war has to be brought to Russia. And now, of course, we have this massive attack on the capital of Russia. And I was wondering, how do you see this situation developing now? What options do Russia have now, and what possible futures are there in front of us?
Well, it's clear that the Ukrainians are going up the escalation ladder here. They're doing more and more to strike at the Russian homeland. And it's quite clear that in the early years of the war, they relied mainly on missiles, and they had a limited number of missiles, and the Europeans and the Americans tended to put significant limits on their use of those Western missiles against Mother Russia. But what's happened now is that the Ukrainians have turned to drones, and they've developed a significant drone force that has the ability to strike into Russia. I think at this point in time, the amount of damage that those drones can do is not that great. And it's certainly not going to affect the outcome of the war in any meaningful way. That's not going to happen. But I think the great danger moving forward here is that the Ukrainians, working with the Europeans, who remain determined to defeat Russia, will increase the number of strikes and the kind of strikes on Russia. I would imagine that the number of drone attacks will go up over time. And at some point, the Ukrainians, with help from the Europeans, will add missiles to the mix. And it'll be missile and drone attacks on Russia. And then the question you have to ask yourself is, what will the Russians do? And you've had Sergei Karaganov on your show. And Sergei Karaganov has said very clearly that he thinks that what should be done is that Russia should strike at European targets to send a very clear signal to the Europeans that this is just unacceptable and this has to stop. And his view is that you start with conventional weapons, and if that doesn't work, you turn to nuclear weapons. Now, he points out, and I think this is very important, that when he first started broaching this idea of his in the early days of the war, he was in a distinct minority. Very few people agreed with him. But he argues now, and I take him at his word because he is an honest person, that the overwhelming majority of people that he talks to agree with him. The Russians, in a sense, are fed up and they're tired of the war in general. And the idea that Ukraine is now escalating by hitting the homeland, the Russian homeland, more and more is just unacceptable. So something has to be done. So I think there's no question, Glenn, that if the war goes on and if Ukraine, working with the Europeans, continues continues to up the ante in terms of striking at Russia, striking at cities like Moscow, the Russians will retaliate along the lines that Karaganov is talking about.
I'm getting the impression that well, the retaliation will come now anyways because it's
Well, when I think about the situation between Russia on one side and Ukraine and the Europeans on the other, it's not altogether unlike the war in Iran, the war between Iran on one side and the United States and the Israelis on the other side. Both sides in both conflicts are unwilling to make any meaningful concessions, and they just want to continue the fight. And you get to the point where some of the participants become desperate and they'll do whatever they think they can get away with to win the war. This is why we're worried about Trump attacking Iran this week, a subject I'm sure we'll get to in due course. We all understand that Trump is desperate. And when you're desperate, you sometimes roll the dice. Uh, Even when you think you're not going to win, you think there may be a sliver of a chance, but it's worth taking a risk. Uh, and if you look at the situation between the Ukrainians and the Europeans on one side and the Russians on the other side, there's just no room for negotiation here. There's no way that this war can be shut down diplomatically. So both sides are going to continue to fight. And the Russians are reaching a point where they're saying to themselves that this has to stop. And the idea that we're going to allow the Ukrainians and the Europeans to take us up the escalation ladder and launch massive attacks against Moscow with drones and missiles is just unacceptable. And we have to stop it. And if that means we have to pursue a really risky strategy, so be it. So I think you see that logic at play very clearly with regard to the Russian-Ukrainian war. And of course, the same logic applies on the Ukraine/European side of the equation. The Ukrainians are desperate to rescue the situation. They're desperate to keep the Europeans involved in the fight, and therefore they want to convince the Europeans that they can do things to the Russians that will turn the tide one way or another. So the Ukrainians have very powerful incentives uh, to up the ante, and the Russians now have very powerful incentives to up the ante. The Europeans have powerful incentives to up the ante, and there's no bargaining space here. So this just tells you we're going to go up the escalation ladder. And as you and I both know, this is not going to have a happy ending. And if we go back to Iran, which I don't want to get into at any detail at this point in time, you can tell a similar story. Uh, so we're in deep trouble, both in the Middle East and in Ukraine.
well, like I said, another commonality though between the Iran war and the Ukraine war is the absence of diplomacy. I think. Well, if you look in Europe, they're still discussing whether or not they should talk to Russia. If they should talk to Russia, who should represent the Europeans? You have people. You have I saw Politico publishing that Kaja Kallas should not, according to some EU diplomats, given that well, she's highly problematic. She's not going to be able to get anywhere with the Russians. And you know, if we decide to talk to the Russians, decide on who should represent the Europeans, then they also have to agree on a common position. And again, we seem to be very, very far away from even sitting down and talking to the Russians. Meanwhile, while this is so difficult to make diplomacy work, going up the escalation ladder seemed to happen without any debate or a second thought at all. It's quite hard to believe this is actually real, but How do you make sense of this, though, the breakdown in diplomacy overall? Because it's a common theme we've seen around the world. That is, it's not work. We're not able to negotiate anything with the significant with the Chinese. At least that's how I saw it. With the Russians, the Iranians, uh, is it simply too many changes happening at once, or how do you make sense of the consistent failure of diplomacy?
Well, I think if you look at the Ukraine conflict, the key to understanding why there's zero bargaining space is that from Russia's point of view, the Ukrainian and European positions represent an existential threat. Um, and obviously, from Ukraine's point of view, and I think increasingly from Europe's point of view, Russia's position, Russia's success in Ukraine represents an existential threat. So you have two sides here, the Europeans and the Ukrainians on one side, and the Russians on the other side, who see this as a war between two sides that are determined to fight to the finish. And there's no room for bargaining here with an existential threat. And the end result is there's no bargaining space. Now, if you factor in the United States, in part because of geography, but also just because the United States is so powerful. And the United States also has incentives to have good relations with the Russians. We meaning the Americans, don't view the Russians as an existential threat. And that, of course, is why Trump is willing to bargain with uh, the Russians. He's not adept at diplomacy. Don't misunderstand me. He's, ham-fisted in the extreme when it comes to doing diplomacy. But nevertheless, he's made it clear that he's willing to cut a deal with Putin. But the problem is Trump can't get to first base because the Europeans and the Ukrainians don't want to negotiate a deal along the lines that Trump is proposing with Russia. So there's just hardly any hope for diplomacy there. And of course, I think Trump, in some ways, has washed his hands of the Russia Ukraine war because he understands that he can't get a deal, that this one has to be settled on the battlefield. So I think that's why you don't have any diplomatic space here.
Well, I guess the $1 million question, though, is would the US enter a war with Russia? Because let's say the Russians launch a conventional strike on Estonia for allowing Ukraine to send its drones through its territory that is attacking the Baltic coast of Russia. How likely do you think it would be for the United States to join in or, well, do something significant if the Russians would do such a limited strike, not for conquering anything, but for essentially retaliating and restoring its deterrence?
That's very hard to say. I mean, if we go back to what Karaganov is talking about, he is talking about attacking NATO countries. Of course, at first it's with conventional weapons. But if you attack a NATO country, at least in the past, that would almost guarantee that the United States would come in. It's not clear what Trump would do at this point in time, given all the trouble that we face uh, in the Middle East. And here we're talking, of course, about the Iran war, but also if you get into a tit for tat with the Russians, and again, this is what Karaganov is proposing, tit for tat. Karaganov understands that, once you start attacking into Western Europe or Eastern Europe, that it's likely that you'll go up the escalation ladder at least somewhat. Uh, so the question is, what does the United States think it can gain by playing tit for tat? And the answer is probably not much. And of course, this is why Karaganov is pushing this idea and why so many people buy into it. So it's not clear the Americans will respond, especially if the attack into Eastern Europe or Western Europe is limited. But who can say for sure? Uh, But you know what's happening here, Glenn? I think the Russians long ago concluded that the West and the Ukrainians, but especially the West, just does not respect red lines. That the West seems to have forgotten that we're dealing with great powers that have nuclear weapons. Uh, as you and I have talked about before, it's truly amazing that the United States and Britain aided Ukraine when it invaded the Russian homeland in the summer of 2024. This is the Kursk offensive. And of course, we then aided Ukraine when it attacked one leg of Russia's strategic nuclear triad. As you've heard me say before, this was unthinkable during the Cold War. The idea that we would help an ally invade the Soviet Union, that would never happen, or that we would help an ally or we ourselves would attack one leg of the strategic nuclear triad. This is just unthinkable. It was just so dangerous. But this is what's happened in the Russia-Ukraine war. And as we've also talked about, there's lots of evidence that Ukraine, with help from the United States and the British, was trying to take out Putin. And all of this makes it clear that the West and the Ukrainians, of course, are willing to behave in what I would describe as reckless ways. And the problem that the Russians face is that they did not respond in any meaningful way in the past when the West did those things. This is one of the reasons I think that Karaganov's argument now gets more traction. I think a lot of Russians understand that they would have been smarter to respond much more forcefully to these provocations that I just described early on. And by not responding, they have allowed the West and the Ukrainians to think that they can get away with striking at the Russian homeland. And of course, this is where we started. You were remarking about these large-scale attacks on Moscow. It's quite clear that the West and the Ukrainians are not deterred. And if anything, as you pointed out, it looks like we're going to go up the escalation ladder. So if you're playing Russia's hand, whether you like the Russians or not, but if you're playing their hand and you see what's happened in the past, you see what's happened over the weekend, and you listen to the Europeans talk, you listen to the Ukrainians talk, and you think about where this is headed, it's pretty obvious to me, and I'm sure to you, that the logical conclusion is that you're going to have to put your foot down, as my mother used to say. And you're going to have to send a very clear signal that this is just unacceptable. And if the West and the Ukrainians want to go up the escalation ladder, you'll go up the escalation ladder with them, and you'll make them pay a god-awful price in the end. So this is basically what's going on here from an escalation point of view. At the same time, you have no bargaining space. And as you know better than I do, this is a remarkably dangerous situation.
Yeah, I think the problem is, I think in NATO, they become overly confident that Russia is deterred because the thinking seems to be, well, Russia would never dare to retaliate because, well, I think the problem is twofold. On one hand, they don't see it as a retaliation because many have convinced themselves that they're not participating in this war. They're just giving weapons to Ukraine, like that's it. But the second would be, yeah, this overconfidence that the Russians are deterred. That is, we can bomb the Russians, attack them, kill them, but they wouldn't dare to respond because then we would bring out the big guns and they wouldn't, so they would be too afraid. Now, once you become too confident in the adversary being deterred, you can do some very crazy things. And I'm just wondering if you see a different deterrence on each side, or how this might go up the escalation ladder, because often I get the impression NATO does more incremental incremental steps up the escalation ladder, a bit up and down, while the Russian team seems to wait and then take bigger steps. So, for example, seizing Crimea in 2014, when the West began to send weapons, they suddenly annexed these four oblasts in 2022. Do you think there's something there that the Russians do not do these small steps and rather do huge steps up the escalation ladder, or in general, how do you see this moving forward?
Well, is what Karaganov is talking about is a huge step. I mean, even if you launched three missiles into Romania and three missiles into Poland, and you killed hardly anyone, and here we're talking about conventional missiles, that would be a huge step because it would be a Russian strike on two members of NATO. Uh, so the Russians don't have to do much to really ratchet things up. Uh, and I think that invariably that's what they're talking about. Now, let me just come at this from a slightly different angle. I did not think we would be at this point because I thought that the Russians would win on the battlefield, and the war would be pretty much settled by now on the battlefield. In my opinion, there's no question that the Russians are winning the war. And even if the war was stopped right now, the Russians have won. They have conquered roughly 20% of eastern Ukraine, and the Ukrainians are not going to recover that territory. Uh, and furthermore, if you look at what's happening on the battlefield, the Ukrainians are losing. The Russians are moving forward, but they're doing so at an incremental pace. And it's because of drones. I mean, drones, which were not manifestly apparent at the beginning of the war, are now manifestly apparent on the battlefield. And it makes it very difficult for the Russians to capture territory quickly and to, in effect, finish off the Ukrainians. I don't think the Ukrainians have enough troops to cover the front lines absent drones. If there were no drones, the front lines would be porous enough that the Russians could rather easily pour through. But given that we have lots of drones in the sky, the Ukrainians, with small numbers of troops, can hold the front lines and make it very difficult for the Russians to make progress. So I think there's no questions the Russians have won the war. And the only interesting question at this point is how much territory, additional territory, they'll end up taking. But the fact is, it's taking time. The Russians cannot count on winning a quick and decisive victory at this moment. And the end result is that there is pressure on the Russians to do something with regard to the ongoing air war that we started talking about. So I think given the slow progress the Russians are making on the battlefield, and given the fact that there is no bargaining space, and given the fact that the Europeans and the Ukrainians seem determined to increase the number and quality of the attacks on the Russian homeland, I think it's inevitable that you're going to get serious escalation. And as I said, it doesn't take a major step by the Russians in terms of number of missiles launched into NATO territory to represent a gigantic leap forward.
I'm still wondering if that message would be, I guess, received as intended in Europe, because it sounds more likely that when Russia finally retaliates, that the Europeans would essentially conclude, "Oh, look, we always told you that after Ukraine, Russia would also attack NATO. This is why we're helping Ukraine." So they wouldn't see it as a deterrent. They would just see it as Moscow's march towards Paris, essentially, something along those lines. I might be mistaken, of course, but um,
Well, if I can just jump in, Glenn,
yeah.
I think what you're missing is that in the background is the nuclear threat. We're not just talking about starting World War I or World War II, which would be absolutely horrible in its own sense, but we're talking about the fact that the Russians have nuclear weapons, and the Karaganov and others are talking about using those nuclear weapons. It's very important to understand that. So once you begin to go up the escalation ladder, everybody understands that at some point up there, it's hard to figure out, exactly where that point is. Your eyes are closed and you're feeling your way up the escalation ladder, right? But somewhere up that ladder, uh, is nuclear use. On one of the rungs is the use of nuclear weapons. And uh, everybody, or almost everybody, is going to want to avoid that. This is what Karaganov understands. The mere threat of nuclear weapons will have huge deterrent value. And I think he's correct in that regard, because we don't want to get incinerated. And what Karaganov is talking about and others are talking about is, getting out on the slippery slope. And once you're out on the slippery slope, who knows how far you're going to slip, right? Again, we're on the escalation ladder. You can't see for sure where you're going. Your eyes are closed, right? You're feeling your way around in the dark, and nuclear weapons may be used. So the argument here is that once you start up the escalation ladder, the incentives for everybody to put an end to it very quickly are very great.
Yeah, so that's why I see the logic in the at strike against a NATO country, not because this is low risk, but doing nothing now. It seems like this is even greater risk because the Europeans already told us where they're gonna take this. We want to bring the war to Russia. We're gonna mass produce long-range missiles and drones to strike deep inside Russia. This is actually what we're gonna do, and they've shown now with this attack on Moscow that this is what they're planning to do. So not doing anything now, it seems almost more reckless than striking NATO, which shows how, well, horrific situation we got ourselves into. That being said, I did want to pivot a bit, though, towards another horrible war which seems to get out of control, which is Iran. From what I understand, after China, there was no meaningful changes. The Iranians don't accept American proposals. The Americans don't accept Iranian proposals. And there's many now warning that a war could be mere hours away, or 24, 48 hours. How do you see this situation developing? The only source of relief or calm now seems to be that it doesn't make any sense. That it's unclear to me what can be achieved, which they didn't achieve in those 40 days. So what are we looking at here?
Well, if you look at the proposals that the Iranians and the Americans are making on how to settle this conflict, you see that they're light years apart. There's no bargaining space here in this conflict, as there is just as there's no bargaining space in the Ukraine/Europe Russia conflict. And therefore, you're not going to get a deal unless they're making concessions behind closed doors that we just don't know about. But there does not appear to be any evidence of that. Everything you see in the public record tells you there's just no agreement on any of the key issues between the two sides. Uh, and Trump is getting desperate. There's just no question about that. We started with a bombing campaign that lasted 40 days. That didn't work. So on April 8th, we moved to a ceasefire. And then our coercive leverage was supposed to come from the blockade. The blockade was the new formula for getting Iran to surrender. The original formula was the 40-day bombing campaign. That didn't work. Well, it's quite clear that the blockade is not working either. And that if it ever is going to work, it's going to take a long time. And time is something that Trump doesn't have. He's got to deal with this quickly. He's got to get a settlement because of the economic consequences of this war. And that means he has really two choices. He can go back to bombing, or he can basically cut a deal on Iran's terms. And he finds it almost impossible to cut a deal on Iran's terms. I think that he hoped that when he went to Beijing, he could talk to the Chinese and the Chinese would be willing to put pressure on Iran. And the Iranians would end up making some significant concessions that would allow Trump to declare victory, even though he would have to make concessions himself. But at least the Iranians would make major concessions too. But there was no evidence the Chinese were willing. There is no evidence the Chinese were willing to do that. So China's not helping. So he's back to square one here. And the question is, what does he do? And I think one gets a sense that he might very well roll the dice and go back to bombing Iran. There's no question that the Israelis and the neoconservatives in the United States are pushing him in that direction. But the problem he faces is that using or launching another bombing campaign is not going to fix the problem. It's not going to cause the Iranians to surrender. Almost everybody understands that. You can inflict massive punishment on Iran, as we did in the first 40 days of the war, and they won't surrender. If anything, they'll become more committed than ever to, hanging in there. And then the other problem that Trump faces is that the Iranians have a second strike capability. And, if you think about restarting the bombing campaign, Glenn, it seems clear to me if it didn't work the first time, you're going to have to even go harder at them the second time. In other words, you're going to have to make the bombing campaign this time around even more intense. It makes common sense. If the bombing campaign didn't work the first time and you expect it to work the second time, it has to be because it's going to be a much more it's going to be a much more it's going to be a much more massive bombing campaign than the 40-day campaign we started the war with. But if you do that, that gives the Iranians a greater incentive to just wreck the entire Gulf, to go after almost every country in the Gulf and do everything possible to destroy those countries, shut down the Red Sea, and so forth and so on. And the end result is that even greater damage will be done to the international economy, and the Iranians will still be in the fight. So I don't see why, from a strategic point of view, Trump wouldn't just accept the fact that we've lost and cut a deal. Is it a good alternative? No, but it's the least bad alternative. Going back to bombing and launching a more massive bombing campaign that we did last time, it's not going to solve the problem. It's just going to make it worse, as I said. But anyway, you don't have the sense, at least from what we can see on the outside, that Trump is willing to make any meaningful concessions to the Iranians and let them walk away with a victory. So it appears that he may very well roll the dice. And that brings us to the Middle East. This is where we are deeply involved in fighting a war. Again, we're not fighting the war in Ukraine. The Ukrainians are fighting the war, and we've been helping them for sure, but we're not doing the actual fighting. And certainly we're not doing any fighting in East Asia, thankfully. But the place where we are doing the fighting is in the Middle East. This is the Iran war. And the question is, what can we do to get out of that? And, it's funny, but I often sort of think about the Vietnam War when I think about the Iran war. And you want to remember in 1968, after President Johnson says that he's not going to run again because he's effectively been destroyed by the Vietnam War, Richard Nixon runs against Hubert Humphrey, and Richard Nixon wins the election in November of 68, and he takes over in January of 69. And Nixon made it clear when he was campaigning that he had a secret plan to end the war, and he was going to end the war quickly. Well, if you look at what happened after Nixon comes into office, he was not interested in ending the war. He wanted to stay in the fight. He did not want to concede defeat. And we actually thought, you know, by 1972, that by using American air power and Vietnamese ground forces, that combination would allow us to hold off the North Vietnamese and forestall defeat. Uh, the Nixon administration did not want to lose in Vietnam. They were constantly searching for a clever strategy to make sure that we could win the war, or at least not lose the war. And of course, what happened in the end is that Congress forced Nixon's hand. Congress told the Nixon administration, you cannot use air power to rescue the situation. May 72, when we stopped the North Vietnamese offensive with tactical air power, was the last gasp. And after that, Congress made it impossible for the Nixon administration to prop up the government in Saigon with air power. And of course, what happened is that Saigon fell, the North Vietnamese won. But Nixon and, of course, Henry Kissinger, who was his national security advisor and then his Secretary of State, they did not want to lose. It's not the American way. And just to go to Afghanistan, as you well know, we were there for 20 years fighting the Taliban. We did not want to lose that war. So what this tells you is when the United States gets into a war, even when it's losing, it is very difficult to accept defeat. Very difficult. The United States is a very powerful country, and it's constantly looking for a way to win. And this is, I think, the basic logic that you see at play in the case of Iran. You and I can point out to them that this war is lost. And in a certain sense, they recognize that, but they just won't accept it. And the belief is there's just got to be a magic formula out there. After all, this is the United States of America, the greatest country in the world, the most powerful country in the world. How can you tell me? How can you tell us that we can't defeat a small country like Iran? This can't be the case. It's that kind of logic that kicks in. And so what you see is Trump thrashing around and his advisors thrashing around looking for a solution. And there's very little evidence, at least in the public record, that anybody on the inside is saying this one's over. We lost. Let's recognize that, cut a deal, and minimize our losses, which is what they should do, because the fact is that we lost this war and there's no way we can rescue the situation. But anyway, all of this is a long-winded way of saying, Glenn, it's going to be very hard to get the United States to accept the fact that it has been defeated by the Iranians. And we will do everything we can to figure out a way to win the war.
The war which the United States started it with a surprise attack. This is over, but now there's a new conflict, which is that Iran is blocking the Strait of Hormuz, and America has to liberate this international waterway. Now, I'm not sure if this is, again, to resell the war as, this time we didn't attack, we're going to open it or, liberate it, or if this is just to sell it to Congress that this is a completely different war than the previous. I'm not sure. How are you seeing this? Because there's so much focus on the information war, the war of narratives these days, that but it's how the actors are seeking to shape the narrative. It is a good indication of where they're going to go with this, though.
Yeah, just to start with Ukraine, there's no question that if you look at the narrative in the West at this point in time, it's that the Ukrainians are winning. They've turned the tide. The Russians are on their back feet and so forth and so on. The great danger there, Glenn, is that gives the Europeans and the Ukrainians an incentive to increase the attacks on the Russian homeland. The argument that people are making is that we finally have the Russians on the run, that these attacks are devastatingly effective, and let's just, ramp up the number and quality of the attacks, and we'll do even better on the battlefield. If you believe that rhetoric, as we discussed before, you're asking for really big trouble. To go to the case of Iran, I think there is some rebranding. I don't think it matters very much. Uh, the question is, what is the United States going to do to defeat Iran and to get our way? Is it going to involve opening the straits? I don't think anybody really believes that we can do that and achieve victory. I think that's why they're talking about the bombing campaign. It really seems to me that you're now at a point with regard to the Iran conflict or the Iran war where you have two choices. Maybe you have three choices. One is to continue the status quo. Two is to accept defeat, cut a deal. And number three is to restart the bombing campaign. Those are the options. But I don't think there's much serious talk about taking the strait. And if they even took the strait, that wouldn't be the end of it, because the Iranians have all sorts of counters that they can turn to. So I think, we are where we are with the Iran war.
Just my last question, is there any other card the US can play here? I mean, do you see any regional actors, Kurds, Azerbaijanis? I mean, anyone they could use, Pakistan, anyone who can essentially take the role of the Ukrainians of the Middle East, someone they can, or the Europeans for that sake, someone they can outsource the war to. It's just hard to see. I don't see anyone with the capabilities that is same as in Europe. I think Ukraine was kind of the last chance to defeat the Russians, but there's no other large proxy army you can build in that part of the world.
No, I mean, if the United States and Israel together could not defeat Iran, who else could? I mean, it looks like the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, are spoiling for a fight with Iran. And in fact, it appears that the UAE participated with the United States and Israel during the 40-day bombing campaign. But the UAE by itself is no match for Iran. And in fact, if the UAE were to get into a fight with Iran, I think the Iranians would destroy the UAE as a country. They'd go after the desalination plants. They'd go after their energy infrastructure. It would be a total disaster for the UAE. In fact, I don't understand why the UAE is not trying to work out some sort of modus vivendi with the Iranians. But of course, they're not. But they're not in a position to take on the Iranians. No, I mean, this is, I think, very simple. If we can't do it militarily, we meaning the United States can't do it militarily with the Israelis, that means it can't be done. And we've failed. And therefore, we have to cut a deal. And that deal is going to reflect the fact that we lost and Iran won. And that is, at this point in time, unacceptable to the United States. And as you can imagine, Glenn, that is categorically unacceptable to the Israelis, because the Israelis view Iran as an existential threat, rightly or wrongly. And so if Trump were to be inclined to cut a deal that reflected the fact that we lost, the Israelis and their supporters in the United States would fight that mightily. And that, of course, makes you wonder, where is this train headed, right? Maybe what I'm saying here is that even if Trump is inclined to cut a deal, the pressure on him not to cut that deal from Israel and its supporters in the United States, who are enormously influential, could prevent him from sitting down with the Iranians. And then you say to yourself, where does this all lead?
Anyways, yep.
Hard to disagree with you. Just one final point, Glenn, just going back to uh, Vietnam. One thing I learned in those days, and it's been proven true uh, over time, is that it's very easy for the United States to get involved in wars, but it's very difficult to get out. You get into these conflicts thinking you're going to win a quick and decisive victory, or you pursue a policy that looks like there's going to be big trouble ahead, but you say to yourself, I can deal with it. I can fix the problem as I move forward. But that is invariably not the case. You rarely win quick and decisive victories when you go to war. Sometimes you do, but uh, and when the United States picks a fight with a country like Iran, I say to myself when it starts that this one is going to be very difficult to get out of. Same thing is true when we invade Iran. I mean, when we invade Afghanistan and when we invade Iraq. I mean, we go into Iraq in 2003. We finally get out in 2011. Then we have to go back in 2014. And we still have troops on the ground in Iraq. We're still interfering in the politics of Iraq. It's really quite amazing. It took us 20 years to get out of Afghanistan, and the Vietnam War was another disaster. But anyway, getting into these conflicts is much easier than getting out of them. That's one lesson I learned a long time ago, and I think these conflicts prove that to be true.
Yeah, well, definitely. Yeah, that's been a lesson over the past 30 years as well. This forever wars, easy to start, hard to finish. And that will definitely be the lesson of the Iran war as well, as the Strait of Hormuz now seems to be lost. Anyways, thank you so much for taking the time, and yeah, hope to see you again soon.
You're welcome, Glenn.